The clock on David's office wall showed 8:47 p.m. Most of his employees had gone home hours ago, but he was still hunched over his laptop, reviewing quarterly reports that seemed to multiply every time he finished one. As the CEO of TechFlow Solutions, a growing software company in Portland, David had learned that the work never really stopped. There was always another meeting to prepare for, another decision to make, another fire to put out. He rubbed his tired eyes and stretched his neck, which had developed a permanent crick from too many late nights like this one. The office building was eerily quiet except for the gentle hum of computers and the distant sound of a vacuum cleaner somewhere down the hall. The cleaning crew was still here, working their way through the maze of cubicles and conference rooms that made up the company's main floor. David stood up and walked to his office window, looking out at the city lights twinkling below. His company occupied the 15th floor of a modern glass building, and on clear nights like this he could see all the way to the mountains. It was moments like these that reminded him why he loved this city and why he had chosen to build his business here instead of moving to Silicon Valley like so many of his competitors. A soft knock on his office door broke his peaceful moment. He turned around expecting to see his assistant or maybe the security guard making his rounds. Instead, he saw Diane, one of the cleaning staff members. She was a woman in her early 50s with kind eyes and graying hair that she always kept, neatly pulled back. David had seen her around the office for about 2 years now, and she always greeted him with a warm smile and a friendly, "Good evening, Mr. David," whenever their paths crossed. "I'm sorry to bother you so late," Diane said, her voice soft and apologetic. She was holding her cleaning cart with one hand and had a small stack of empty containers tucked under her other arm. "I was wondering if I could ask you something." "Of course," David replied, gesturing for her to come in. "What can I help you with?" Diane hesitated for a moment, shifting the containers in her arms. "Well, I was cleaning the main conference room, and I noticed there's still a lot of food left over from today's board meeting. Those fancy sandwiches and the fruit platters. The desserts, too. It's all just sitting there, and I know it's probably just going to get thrown away tomorrow." David nodded. The company had hosted its quarterly board meeting that afternoon, and as usual, they had ordered way too much food. It was a recurring problem that bothered him from an environmental standpoint, but somehow they never seemed to get the portions right. There was always either too little food, leaving people hungry, or too much, leading to massive waste. "You're probably right," he said. "We always seem to over-order for these things." Diane shifted nervously from foot to foot. "I was wondering, if it's okay with you, if I could take some of that food home instead of letting it go to waste. I brought these containers from home, and I promise I won't take more than what would just get thrown away anyway." The request caught David slightly off guard, not because it was unreasonable, but because no one had ever asked before. He thought about all the times he had seen perfectly good food dumped into trash bags after company events, and it had always struck him as wasteful. His company prided itself on being environmentally conscious with recycling programs and energy-efficient practices, yet they were literally throwing away food that could feed people. "Absolutely," he said without hesitation. "That's actually a great idea. I hate seeing all that food go to waste." Relief washed over Diane's face and her shoulders relaxed visibly. "Thank you so much, Mr. David. I really appreciate it. I'll be very careful not to make a mess or anything." "Don't worry about that," David said. "Take whatever you want. Better that someone enjoys it than it ending up in a landfill." Diane smiled broadly and hurried off toward the conference room. David found himself curious about her situation. Was she struggling financially? Did she have a large family to feed? Or was she simply someone who, like him, hated to see good food wasted? He realized he knew very little about the personal lives of his cleaning staff, even though they worked in his building every night. A few minutes later, he decided to take a break from his reports and wandered toward the conference room to see how the cleanup was going. What he saw there made him pause in the doorway. Diane was methodically and carefully packing food into her containers, but not in the way someone might if they were simply grabbing free food for themselves. She was organizing everything with the precision of someone who had a specific plan in mind. She had separated the sandwiches into different containers, apparently sorting them by type. The fruit was being packed into another container, with care, taken to ensure nothing would get bruised. The desserts were wrapped individually in napkins before being placed in a third container. She had even brought plastic bags to keep everything fresh, and she was labeling each container with a pen she had pulled from her uniform pocket. "Getting everything organized?" David asked, stepping into the room. Diane looked up, a slight flush of embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "Yes, sir. I just want to make sure everything stays fresh. It's such beautiful food, it would be a shame to let it spoil." There was something in her tone that made David think there was more to this than simple meal planning for her family. The way she was organizing everything suggested she had multiple people in mind, not just herself or even a typical household. But he didn't want to pry into her personal business, especially since she seemed slightly uncomfortable with his presence. "Take your time," he said, "and please don't feel like you need to rush on my account. I'm probably going to be here for another hour anyway." After Diane finished packing the food and wheeled her cart toward the elevator, David found himself thinking about the interaction. There had been something almost reverent about the way she had handled the food, as if each sandwich and piece of fruit was precious. It wasn't the casual attitude of someone taking advantage of a workplace perk. It was the careful attention of someone who understood the real value of what she was taking. Over the next few weeks, David began to notice a pattern. Whenever the company had catered events, meetings with lunch provided, or office celebrations with food, Diane would always approach him or one of the managers afterward to ask if she could take home any leftovers. She never assumed it was okay. She always asked permission first, and she always brought her own containers, her own bags, her own supplies to transport everything properly. Other employees began to notice too. David overheard a few conversations in the break room, some positive and some less so. A few people commented that it was nice to see the food being put to good use instead of wasted. Others whispered about whether it was appropriate for cleaning staff to be taking company food, even if it was just going to be thrown away. The comments bothered David more than he expected them to. Diane was solving a problem that the company had never managed to solve on its own, and she was doing it in a way that hurt no one and helped someone. Yet some people seemed to view her actions with suspicion or disapproval. It made him realize that sometimes the most practical solutions come from unexpected places, and not everyone is comfortable with that reality. 3 weeks had passed since that first evening when Diane asked about the leftover food, and David found himself paying more attention to the company's catering habits than ever before. It seemed like every few days there was some kind of meeting or event that required food, and without fail, Diane would appear after hours with her neat stack of containers, asking politely if she could take what would otherwise be thrown away. Tuesday brought the monthly client presentation meeting, complete with an elaborate lunch spread that the catering company had insisted was perfectly portioned for 30 people. Only 18 clients showed up, and half of them seemed more interested in the presentation slides than the gourmet wraps and salads that cost the company nearly $400. By the time the meeting ended, more than half the food remained untouched. David was heading back to his office when he spotted Diane pushing her cleaning cart down the hallway. Even though her official shift didn't start for another 2 hours, she often came in early to get a head start on the larger conference rooms. She gave him her usual warm smile and nod. "Good afternoon, Mr. David. How did your meeting go?" "Very well, thank you," he replied. "Though I think we could have fed twice as many people with all that food we ordered." Diane's eyes lit up with interest, but she didn't immediately ask about the leftovers like he had come to expect. Instead, she simply nodded and continued with her work. It wasn't until nearly 6 o'clock that evening that she approached his office, containers in hand, with her familiar polite request. What struck David this time was how quickly and efficiently she worked. Diane had clearly developed a system over the past few weeks. She knew exactly how to pack different types of food to keep them fresh, which containers worked best for what items, and how to organize everything so nothing would spill or get damaged during transport. She moved with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. But it was more than just efficiency that caught his attention. There was a sense of urgency in her movements, as if getting this food properly packed and transported was genuinely important to her. She wasn't just casually taking leftovers home for an easy dinner. This felt like a mission. The following week, the company hosted its annual employee appreciation event in the main lobby. They had hired a local restaurant to cater the affair, and the spread was impressive. Carved meats, pasta dishes, fresh bread salads, and an entire dessert table that looked like something from a fancy wedding. The event was scheduled from 4 to 7 in the evening, designed so that employees could grab dinner before heading home. David mingled with his staff, pleased to see people relaxing and enjoying themselves outside of their usual work environment. He noticed Diane there too, not as part of the cleaning crew but as an invited employee. She was dressed in casual clothes instead of her usual uniform, and she seemed to be enjoying a plate of food while chatting with a few other staff members from different departments. What he found interesting was that despite being at the event as a guest, Diane ate very little. She took small portions, seemed to savor what she did eat, but spent most of her time talking with people rather than focusing on the food. For someone who had been regularly taking home leftovers for weeks, her restrained approach to the buffet seemed almost contradictory. As the event wound down and employees began to leave, David hung around to make sure everything went smoothly with the cleanup. The catering staff was packing up their equipment, and there was still a substantial amount of food left over. Much more than usual, actually, since this had been a larger event with more generous portions. Around 8:30, as the lobby was nearly empty except for the catering crew and a few lingering employees, David saw Diane return. She had changed back into her work uniform and was carrying her usual collection of containers. But tonight, she had brought more containers than he had ever seen her with before. She had a large insulated bag and what looked like enough storage, containers to pack up a significant amount of food. She approached the catering manager first, politely asking if it would be possible to take some of the leftover food rather than having it disposed of. The catering manager looked uncertain and glanced around for someone in authority to make the decision. David stepped forward. "It's fine," he told the catering manager. "Diane has permission to take whatever leftovers we're not keeping." The relief on Diane's face was immediate and profound. She thanked both David and the catering manager, then began her careful packing process. But tonight, with so much more food available, David got a better sense of just how much she typically took home. It wasn't just a few containers for a family dinner. She was packing enough food to feed a dozen people or more. As he watched her work, David found himself growing more and more curious about what exactly she was doing with all this food. The quantity suggested she wasn't just feeding her immediate family. The care she took in packing and organizing everything suggested this wasn't just about saving money on groceries. And the fact that she had come prepared with so many containers suggested she had anticipated there would be substantial leftovers. "Diane," he said, approaching her as she sealed the last container. "You must have a pretty big family to feed with all that food." She paused, and for a moment David thought he saw something flicker across her face. Uncertainty, maybe. Or perhaps she was trying to decide how much to tell him. "Something like that," she said finally, her voice quiet. "I just hate to see good food go to waste when there are people who could really use it." It was a diplomatic answer that didn't really answer his question at all. David sensed that there was much more to the story, but he also recognized that Diane was being intentionally vague. She had her reasons for privacy, and he didn't want to push too hard and make her uncomfortable. Over the next few days, David found himself thinking about that conversation more than he expected to. Diane's words kept echoing in his mind. "When there are people who could really use it." The way she had said it suggested she had specific people in mind, not just a general concern about food waste. He also began to notice things he had missed before. Diane always stayed late on the evenings when there were leftovers to pack up, but she never seemed to eat any of the food herself during her work shift. She would pack everything carefully, load it into her car, and then drive away. She never lingered to sample what she was taking or treated it as a personal meal. The office gossip about Diane's food collecting had continued and even intensified after the employee appreciation event. Some people admired her environmental consciousness and practical approach to reducing waste. Others questioned whether it was appropriate for her to be taking so much food, even if it was just going to be thrown away. A few suggested that the company should have official policies about leftover food to avoid any appearance of impropriety. David found the negative comments increasingly irritating. Diane was solving a problem that had bothered him for years, and she was doing it without costing the company anything or creating any additional work for anyone else. She was being respectful, discreet, and helpful. The fact that some people viewed her actions with suspicion said more about them than it did about her. But the comments also made him realize that he needed to understand the full situation better. If Diane was doing something that could be viewed as controversial, he wanted to make sure she was protected. And if she was doing something remarkable, he wanted to make sure she was supported. His curiosity had grown from casual interest to genuine concern. Whatever Diane was doing with all that food, it was clearly important to her. And David was beginning to suspect it might be important to other people too. The company's quarterly celebration was bigger than usual. They had just landed their largest client ever, and David wanted to make sure the entire team felt appreciated for their hard work. He had splurged on catering from one of the city's most popular restaurants, complete with carved turkey, honey, glazed ham, vegetarian options, fresh rolls, 3 different salads, and a dessert table that looked like it belonged at a 5-star hotel. The celebration lasted from 3 in the afternoon until almost 7 in the evening. Employees brought their families, kids ran around the office lobby, and everyone seemed to be having a great time. But as David looked at the food tables around 6 o'clock, he realized they had once again dramatically over-ordered. There was enough food left to feed another 50 people. As the party wound down and families began heading home, David found himself thinking about Diane. She had been at the celebration earlier with what he assumed was her teenage grandson, a polite young man who had thanked David personally for including families in the event. But David hadn't seen her since around 5 o'clock, and he wondered if she would return later to deal with the massive amount of leftover food. By 8:30, the office was nearly empty except for the catering crew packing up their equipment. David was getting ready to head home himself when he saw Diane's familiar figure coming through the main entrance. She had changed out of the nice dress she had worn to the party and was back in her work clothes, pushing a larger cart than usual and carrying what looked like several insulated bags. She went through her usual routine of politely asking the catering manager about the leftover food, and David gave his standard approval. But tonight was different. There was so much food that even with all the containers and bags she had brought, Diane was going to need to make multiple trips to her car. David offered to help her carry some of the containers, and as they walked together toward the parking garage, he found himself building up the courage to ask the question that had been bothering him for weeks. "Diane," he said as they loaded the last batch of containers into her car, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but you always pack up so much food. Do you run some kind of catering business on the side?" She laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. "Oh no, nothing like that. I know people who can use good food when they can get it." "That's really thoughtful of you," David said. "It must take a lot of time to distribute all this." Diane closed her car trunk and turned to face him. In the dim light of the parking garage, he could see that she was weighing her words carefully. "It doesn't feel like work when you know it's helping people," she said finally. "There are folks in my neighborhood who don't always know where their next meal is coming from. When I see all this beautiful food that's just going to get thrown away, it seems wrong not to do something about it." David felt a wave of respect wash over him. Diane wasn't just taking leftover food home for convenience or to save money. She was running her own unofficial food distribution program, using her position at the company to rescue food that would otherwise be wasted and getting it to people who genuinely needed it. "That's incredible," he said. "How long have you been doing this?" "A few years now," Diane replied, getting into her car. "Started small, just taking extra food to my neighbor who was having a hard time after her husband passed. But word gets around in the neighborhood when someone's helping out, and before I knew it, I had a whole list of families who could use a good meal now and then." As Diane drove away, David stood in the parking garage thinking about what she had just told him. Here was an employee making probably a quarter of what he made annually, spending her own time and gas money to help feed people in her community. She was doing it quietly, without asking for recognition or support, just because she saw a need and had the ability to help. But something nagged at him. If Diane was feeding multiple families, where exactly was she taking all this food? Did she store it at her house and distribute it later? Did she drive around to different homes? The logistics of what she was describing seemed complicated, especially for someone doing it entirely on their own. His curiosity got the better of him. David knew it was probably crossing a line, but he found himself genuinely concerned about Diane's safety. She was a woman in her 50s driving around alone at night with a car full of food, apparently visiting multiple locations in neighborhoods he wasn't familiar with. What if something happened to her? What if she broke down or had car trouble? Before he could talk himself out of it, David got in his own car and pulled out of the parking garage a few minutes behind Diane. He told himself he just wanted to make sure she got to her first destination safely. He wouldn't follow her all evening, just long enough to see that she was okay. Diane's route took her through parts of the city that David rarely visited. She drove through older residential neighborhoods with small houses and narrow streets, past corner stores with security bars on their windows, and bus stops where a few people sat waiting for late evening routes. It wasn't a dangerous area, but it was clearly a community where people were working hard just to get by. After about 15 minutes of driving, Diane pulled into the parking lot of a small community center. David had driven past this building dozens of times over the years but had never really noticed it. It was a modest, single-story structure with a simple sign that read, Riverside Community Center. The parking lot was nearly full, which surprised David since it was almost 9 o'clock on a Thursday evening. He parked across the street where he could see the building but hopefully wouldn't be noticed. Through the large windows facing the parking lot, he could see that the main room inside was filled with people. There were folding tables set up, and it looked like some kind of meeting or event was taking place. David watched as Diane parked near the front entrance and began unloading containers from her car. But she wasn't alone. Several people came out of the building to help her carry everything inside. An elderly man in a jacket that had seen better days took 2 of the heavier containers. A woman about Diane's age grabbed an insulated bag and what looked like bags of rolls. Even a couple of teenagers came out to help with the lighter containers. What struck David was how organized everything seemed. This wasn't a random act of kindness where Diane showed up unexpectedly with food. These people were clearly expecting her. They knew exactly what to do and where to take everything. This was a regular operation, not an occasional good deed. Through the windows, David could see Diane inside the community center, and what he witnessed made him realize he had completely underestimated what she was doing. The folding tables weren't set up for a meeting. They were set up like a dining room. People were sitting at the tables with plates in front of them, and Diane and several volunteers were setting up a buffet line with the food she had brought from the office. There were elderly people, families with young children, a few individuals who looked like they might be homeless, and several people who appeared to be struggling financially, but were trying to maintain their dignity. Everyone was being served with the same respect and kindness, regardless of their circumstances. David sat in his car, stunned by what he was seeing. Diane hadn't just been taking leftover food to help a few neighbors. She was running a full-scale community dinner program, feeding what looked like 40 or 50 people, and she was doing it entirely with food that would have otherwise been thrown away by his company and probably other businesses around the city. He watched as Diane moved through the room, not just serving food, but stopping to talk with people, checking on how they were doing, laughing at something a child said, patting an elderly woman's shoulder in a gesture of comfort. She clearly knew these people personally. This wasn't charity in the distant, impersonal sense. This was community care at its most fundamental level. David realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. While he had been running a successful business and congratulating himself on the company's modest charitable contributions, one of his employees had been quietly creating her own solution to hunger in her community. She had identified a resource that was being wasted, figured out how to rescue it, and built an entire support network around getting it to people who needed it most. And she had been doing it all along, week after week, without asking for help, or recognition, or even acknowledgement that what she was doing was remarkable. David sat in his car for over an hour, watching the scene unfold inside the community center. He couldn't bring himself to leave. What he was witnessing challenged everything he thought he knew about making a difference in the world. Through the large windows, he could see Diane moving from table to table like a graceful host at an elegant dinner party. But this wasn't about elegance or appearances. This was about something much deeper. She stopped at each table, spending time with the people there, listening to their stories, sharing in their conversations. An elderly man showed her what looked like photos from his wallet, and Diane smiled and nodded as if she genuinely cared about whatever he was sharing. A young mother with 2 small children was trying to manage her toddler while eating, and Diane naturally stepped in to help, entertaining the child while the mother could finish her meal in peace. What struck David most was how comfortable everyone seemed. This wasn't a typical charity situation where people felt awkward or embarrassed about receiving help. These folks were relaxed, laughing, treating each other like family. They weren't just getting fed. They were getting fed with dignity, respect, and genuine human connection. A teenager who looked like he was probably in high school was helping serve food and clean up tables. He moved with the same efficient kindness that David had observed in Diane, suggesting that this wasn't his first time volunteering here. When he finished wiping down a table, he sat down with an elderly woman who was eating alone and struck up a conversation with her. David realized that Diane hadn't just created a food program, she had created a community. Around 10 o'clock, people began to slowly leave the community center. David watched as Diane made sure everyone had containers to take extra food home with them. She wasn't just providing one meal, she was making sure people had something for tomorrow, too. The elderly man who had helped her carry containers earlier left with a bag that looked like it contained enough food for several days. The young mother left with multiple containers, probably enough to feed her children for the rest of the week. But what really got to David was watching how people said goodbye to Diane. These weren't the polite thank yous of people receiving charity. These were the warm farewells of people who genuinely cared about each other. The elderly woman hugged Diane like she was saying goodbye to her own daughter. The teenager fist-bumped her and promised to see her next week. The young mother's children ran up to give Diane hugs before they left. As the last families departed, David watched Diane and a few volunteers clean up the community center. They worked together like a well-practiced team, folding tables, stacking chairs, washing dishes, and putting everything back in order. Even the cleanup was done with care and attention, making sure the space was left better than they found it. David found himself thinking about his own company's charitable efforts. TechFlow Solutions donated money to various causes throughout the year, and they had participated in a few community service projects. But those efforts felt distant and impersonal compared to what he was witnessing here. His company wrote checks to organizations they hoped were doing good work, but they rarely saw the direct impact of their contributions. They volunteered for a day here and there, but it was usually organized events where they showed up, did some work, and left feeling good about themselves. What Diane was doing was completely different. This was ongoing, personal, and deeply connected to the real needs of specific people. She wasn't just addressing hunger in an abstract sense. She was making sure that Mrs. Johnson had something to eat this week, that the Rodriguez children had nutritious meals, that Mr. Peterson didn't have to choose between buying food and buying his medication. As Diane finally locked up the community center and walked to her car, David realized he was seeing leadership in its purest form. She hadn't waited for permission or funding or official support. She had seen a problem, identified resources that could help solve it, and then built a solution from the ground up. She had created something sustainable that was making a real difference in people's lives, and she had done it all while working a full-time job that probably didn't pay her nearly enough. David started his car and drove home, but his mind was racing with thoughts about what he had witnessed. He kept thinking about the contrast between his world and the world he had just observed. In his daily life, he spent most of his time in meetings talking about quarterly projections, market share, and competitive advantages. He worried about things like whether the office coffee was good enough and whether the company's health insurance plan was competitive with other tech firms. Meanwhile, Diane was dealing with real problems that affected people's basic survival and dignity. She was using creativity, compassion, and personal sacrifice to address issues that many people preferred to ignore or assume someone else would handle, and she was doing it without any recognition, support, or compensation beyond the satisfaction of knowing she was helping people who needed it. The more David thought about it, the more he realized how much he had underestimated not just Diane, but probably many of the people who worked for his company. He spent so much time focused on the business side of things that he rarely thought about his employees as complete human beings with rich lives and complex challenges outside of work. How many other people on his staff were doing remarkable things in their communities that he knew nothing about? He also began to think about the resources his company wasted every day. The leftover food was just the beginning. They threw away office supplies that were perfectly good, but had been replaced with newer versions. They had old computers and equipment that might not be suitable for a tech company anymore, but could probably be useful to schools or community organizations. They paid for cleaning supplies and paper products that often ended up in the trash when there were overorders or changes in preferred brands. David had always thought of himself as a socially responsible business owner. His company had good employee benefits. They tried to be environmentally conscious and they made charitable donations. But watching Diane work made him realize that being socially responsible was about more than just following best practices and writing checks. It was about recognizing the human impact of every decision and looking for ways to use resources to benefit people instead of just maximizing profit. By the time David got home that night, he had made a decision. He couldn't just pretend he hadn't seen what he had seen. Diane's work was too important and too impressive to ignore, but he also knew he needed to be careful about how he approached the situation. She had clearly been intentionally private about what she was doing, and he didn't want to embarrass her or make her feel like her privacy had been violated. He spent most of the weekend thinking about the best way to handle things. He researched the Riverside Community Center online and learned that it was a nonprofit organization that had been serving the neighborhood for over 20 years. They offered various programs including job training, tutoring for kids, and support services for elderly residents. But nowhere on their website did he see any mention of a regular dinner program. David realized that Diane had probably started this program on her own initiative, without any official partnership or support from the community center. She had seen a need, found a way to meet it, and convinced the center to let her use their space. It was another example of her ability to create solutions instead of waiting for someone else to solve problems. By Monday morning, David knew he had to say something to Diane. He couldn't continue their normal interactions knowing what he now knew without acknowledging the incredible work she was doing. But he also knew that whatever he said needed to be thoughtful, respectful, and focused on supporting her efforts rather than making her feel exposed or uncomfortable. The question was, how to approach a conversation that would change everything between them and potentially change everything about how his company operated. David spent the entire weekend planning what he would say to Diane. He wrote down different approaches, practiced conversations in his head, and even rehearsed in front of his bathroom mirror on Sunday morning. Nothing felt right. How do you tell someone that you followed them and discovered their secret without sounding like a creep? How do you express admiration for someone's work without making them feel like you've been spying on them? Monday morning came too quickly. David arrived at the office early, hoping to catch Diane before her shift officially started. He knew she often came in around 7 to get a head start on the larger conference rooms, and he wanted to have this conversation privately, away from other employees who might overhear. At 7:15, he spotted Diane pushing her cart off the elevator. She looked surprised to see him there so early. "Good morning, Mr. David," she said with her usual warm smile. "You're here early today?" "Good morning, Diane. I was hoping I could talk with you for a few minutes if you have time." Something in his tone must have alerted her that this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. Her smile became more cautious, and David could see a flicker of concern in her eyes. "Of course," she said. "Is everything okay? Did I do something wrong with the food the other night?" No, nothing like that," David said quickly. "Actually, it's quite the opposite. Could we step into my office?" Diane followed him down the hallway, and David could feel the tension building with each step. He had no idea how she was going to react to what he was about to tell her. Once they were in his office with the door closed, David gestured for Diane to sit down. She perched on the edge of the chair like she was ready to leave quickly if necessary. Diane, David began, then stopped. All his practiced words seemed to disappear. He decided to just be honest. I need to start by apologizing to you. Last Thursday, after you loaded all that food into your car, I followed you. Diane's face went very still. David could see her trying to process what he had just said. I told myself I was just concerned about your safety, driving around alone at night with all that food. But if I'm being completely honest, I was curious about what you were doing with everything and what I saw. David paused, trying to find the right words. What I saw was absolutely incredible. Diane's hands were folded tightly in her lap, and she was staring at them instead of looking at David. He could see that she was embarrassed, maybe even scared about where this conversation was going. I watched you at the community center. David continued. I saw how you were feeding all those people, how you knew everyone personally, how much care you put into everything. I realized that you've been running an entire community dinner program, and you've been doing it with food that our company would have just thrown away. Diane finally looked up at him, and David was surprised to see that her eyes were filled with tears. Mr. David, I'm so sorry, she said, her voice shaking. I know I should have asked for permission before taking so much food. I know it probably looks bad, like I'm taking advantage of my position here. If you need to fire me, I understand. Fire you? David was genuinely shocked. Diane, I'm not here to fire you. I'm here to tell you that what you're doing is amazing, and I'm ashamed that I didn't know about it sooner. The relief on Diane's face was immediate, but she still looked confused. I spent all weekend thinking about what I saw, David said. You've created something remarkable. You're feeding dozens of people every week. You're building community connections. You're treating everyone with dignity and respect. And you're doing it all on your own time, with your own resources, without asking for any help or recognition. Diane wiped her eyes with a tissue from the box on David's desk. It started small, she said quietly, just helping out my neighbor who was struggling after her husband died. But then I realized how much good food was getting thrown away here every week, and I knew there were other people in my neighborhood who could really use it. The community center let me use their space because they could see it was helping people. How long have you been doing this? David asked. About 3 years now. We serve dinner every Thursday night and sometimes on other days when there's extra food available. Last week we fed 47 people. David shook his head in amazement. 47 people, every week, for 3 years. Diane, do you realize what you've accomplished? She shrugged, looking embarrassed by the praise. It's just food that would have gone to waste anyway. And the people in my neighborhood, they're not looking for handouts. They're just going through tough times. Mrs. Patterson lost her job last year and hasn't found another one yet. The Johnson family, their dad got sick and they've got medical bills piling up. Mr. Rodriguez, he's elderly and living on Social Security. That barely covers his rent. These are good people who just need a little help getting by. David felt a surge of respect for Diane that was almost overwhelming. She wasn't just talking about helping people in abstract terms. She knew these people personally, understood their specific situations, and had created a solution that addressed their actual needs. Diane, David said, I want to help you expand what you're doing. I want to make this an official company program. She looked at him skeptically. What do you mean? I mean I want to formalize our food donation program and put you in charge of it. Instead of just taking leftovers from our events, we could partner with other businesses in the area to rescue food that would otherwise be wasted. We could provide you with better transportation, more storage containers, maybe even help you find additional locations to serve meals. Diane was quiet for a long moment, considering what he was proposing. Would this mean I wouldn't be cleaning offices anymore? She asked. It would mean you'd have a new job title and a significant raise, David said. Community Outreach Coordinator. You'd still be based here at the company, but your job would be focused on expanding and managing the food rescue and